Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's NQA webinar on operational resilience, business continuity, and ISO 22301. I'm Tim Pennell, and I have the pleasure of being your presenter for the next 45 minutes. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. I'll be answering them at the end, but I hope to get through them as much as possible. And also, as a reminder, you'll be getting a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides at the end. And as ever, if there's anything you'd like to discuss further, please get in touch with me via LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to discuss the matter further. So the agenda for today. So the term operational resilience has been brought to the fore as a result of the current COVID-19 pandemic, and it's never been more in the spotlight. It transcends all sectors of the economy, and it's applicable in every industry. And this is not the first time such operational resilience has been tested. It's a fairly common occurrence, albeit perhaps not as universal as we're currently experiencing with COVID-19. But operational resilience is frequently conflated with business continuity and with incident management. And indeed, it can mean different things and have different consequences for organizations depending on their services and sectors. And in fact, I found myself doing that whilst writing this brief. Nonetheless, in this presentation, I want to discuss what is operational resilience. I'll compare and contrast various definitions and relate them to management system standards, of course. And I'll take a look at what a resilient organization typically looks like. And then I'll discuss in detail ISO 22301, its benefits, and how to implement it. And throughout this, I'll season it with my own experiences and case studies of when things went wrong and what we did about it. So we'll start off with definitions of operational resilience. And it means different things to different people. In the Army, it's a multifaceted thing, but one that has been developed through much hard-won experience over the centuries. Hygiene is a case in point. The military are terrified of diarrhea, not of the effect on the individual, but on the overall fighting capability if it spreads. An army can't fight from the toilet seat, which is why COVID has had a limited impact on the armed services, because they're good at managing unintended change and dealing with ambiguity, especially fluid situations, such as a diarrhea outbreak. So how about this for a definition? Operational resilience is the ability to alter operations in the face of changing business conditions. It is the ability to quickly ramp up or slow down with quick and local process modification. That tells me that operational resilience is both a defensive measure and a business opportunity. And here's an example. I worked for a telco that sold unified communication services. We sold two competing products, which both included a mobile handset and a personal business number. One was better than the other, but it was more expensive, so we gave customers choice. Now, the way telephone numbering works is that Ofcom assign ranges of telephone numbers to telcos, who then internally assign their ranges across their products. And one day, the person who had imported the numbers for the cheaper product accidentally imported the same range again for the more expensive product. This meant that every time a customer bought the expensive product, they were given a number that was already in use by another customer. And the logic in the network meant that all calls and texts were routed to the new customers only. So our incident management process swung into action, but we were presented with an immediate dilemma. Which customer would lose out by being given a new number? Significant concerns were raised about the damage to our brand, and the marketing teams were closely watching Twitter and Facebook. But in the end, the solution was simple. We upsold at a discount the more expensive product to the customers whose number had been taken. There was no brand damage and an eventual increase in revenues, as most of the customers were migrated to the more expensive product. All C&I sectors have resilience obligations placed upon them, not just telcos, by their sector regulators. The finance sector in particular has had very recent focus following Lehman Brothers, Northern Rock, and RBS, to name a few. The Financial Conduct Authority, the Prudential Regulation Authority, and the Bank of England have issued new requirements to strengthen operational resilience in the financial services sector. and their outward-facing awareness of the societal impact in the event of a resilience event. And then the maximum level of tolerable operation disruption that you could cope with will be determined by the regulator, not the banks. The banks are no longer trusted to work that out. The banks have been expected to put major improvements to outsourcing and supply chain governance, improved understanding of the complex interdependencies between business functions and suppliers suppliers to suppliers. And then they need increased internal operational resilience expertise. It also serves to highlight the importance of cash or a good credit line during the pandemic. COVID has shown just how brittle supply chains have become. Just-in-time, lean, and other modern business practices have thinned out businesses to maximum efficiency, but with very little toleration for disruption. Those businesses that have got fat in the system, that can afford to have stock and plants sitting idle during normal operations, have been best placed to ride this out. In particular, those with cash reserves are surviving. This, of course, is enterprise resilience, but its operational resilience gone wrong threatens the enterprise as a whole. So my next definition takes this into account. Similar but different. Operational resilience is the ability to adapt to risk that affects its core operational abilities. It is a property of effective risk management. It is a subset of enterprise resilience, the ability to manage operational risk. That being the case, then, what does an operationally resilient organization look like? Well, it's a combination of business continuity management, health and safety, security, disaster recovery management, environmental management, and most importantly, organizational culture. Yet, from my research, 53% of UK organizations don't have adequate capabilities to cope with the disruption. These surveys that I've seen suggest that in a typical year, organizations will have some form of disruption. 5% have experienced a fire, 25% have IT issues, 25% have telecoms issues. And indeed, a couple of months ago, the Tokyo Stock Exchange went off air due to a hardware failure. That should not have happened because it was entirely predictable. And 28% have extreme weather events. Note that these don't have to be big incidents. It's just that stuff happens and organizations have to deal with it. But some, of course, are better than others. During the Fukushima reactor disaster in Japan, I was an on-call civil resilience officer. We were concerned that we might have to evacuate staff from Tokyo, but we had major Japanese customers who depended on us as a supplier. In the end, our duty of care prevailed, and we decided to evacuate the staff and try to run the services remotely from another country. So we counted up the staff and started the process of chartering a plane. But of course, the staff have families at home, so they had to come as well, naturally. But you can't leave the grandparents behind, and then you can't leave the maid. The maid has a family, and the maid has grandparents, and so on and so on. Oh, and what about the beloved pets? So who in the organization was going to be brave enough to draw the line? Well, in the end, the employee settled it for us. They refused to leave as a matter of honor, and some even camped down in the offices to ensure continuity of service. The question then is, did the organization exhibit the characteristics of an operationally resilient organization? Which are top-level commitment. And this really is about the top-level management, the senior management, committing to business continuity. Preparedness, being prepared for those events that go wrong. And flexibility, as I've described in the definitions, the ability to adjust depending on the changing nature of the circumstances. And then awareness. This is your horizon scanning, your radar, knowing what's out there. But then opacity is that awareness of your limitations as an organization and how close you are to them. A just culture, and this is about the reporting of issues, whistleblowing if you like, enabling employees to call out these issues before they become bad. And then a risk-based culture. As you'll see through these slides, everything I talk about is thinking about the risks and therefore what is your risk appetite and what you need to do about them. Now, preparedness, if I can just go back to that again, is interesting. There are some who have said we didn't see COVID coming. Well, I don't agree with that. Over 10 years ago, I wrote the pandemic plans for an organization based in North and South America. So an operationally resilient organization is operating within the plan, do, check, act cycle, even if it doesn't have a management system. But it is continuously finding and assessing its vulnerabilities and its supply chain vulnerabilities, reducing the likelihood of disruption with planning, controls, flexibility, and redundancies, detecting disruption in itself and its supply chains. And it's very interesting noting the effects that COVID have had on cybersecurity, whereby IT security managers have spent so much effort enabling remote access that they've taken their eye off the ball, and it's taking them longer to detect cyber attacks or cyber breaches, and then even longer to respond to those attacks. And then finally, it's measuring operational resilience. And it's this last one that's most difficult. How do you know how operationally resilient your organization is? Well, of course, implementing all management system standards is definitely the way to go. 14,001, 22,301, 27,001, 45,001 are ticking those boxes. And so you're to be applauded for achieving them. And again, it's within the plan, do, check, act cycle where you measure through observation, recording, testing, and reviewing. I also have a quick and dirty method for measuring operational resilience as well, if you like. And again, please reach out to me via LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to share that with you further. Now, I mentioned those management systems. There are several of them, and I'm going to run through them here now, and they can play a key role in your operational resilience. All organizations need to ensure resilient strategies are integrated into their activities, particularly business critical functions and processes. Just like national governments have mechanisms to respond to crises and the unforeseen, every organization that desires to continue through adversity must also do the same. And as you'd expect me to say, the plan, do, check, act cycle is fundamental to this. ANNEX SL is, and I'll cover that later if you're not familiar with it, is that homogenization that means the following standards complement each other during an organization's journey towards operational resilience. The process of ensuring business continuity is contained within ISO 22301-2019, which I'll cover next. But for comparison with the other standards, in 22301 are the requirements to conduct business impact analysis and risk assessments. This helps identify potential disruption scenarios and the critical processes that need a recovery strategy. And it helps determine what level of response and recovery capabilities are required. So how long can we cope with the disruption? What alternatives are there? What resources do we need to recover? To what level do we need to recover? By when do we need to recover? And who do we need to tell? 27001 is an information security standard. A key tenet of information security is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the standard says conduct a risk assessment, much like 22301, and identify your CIA risks on information assets. And then it requires you to have an incident management process, which has very similar requirements to 22301 for managing business continuity incidents in the event of, say, a cyber breach. But it also requires you to have information security continuity planning in the event of a crisis or disaster. And like 22301, it requires you to test and practice your business continuity processes. Therefore, availability of CIA is often the driver for IT security planning, but of course it's not the be-all and end-all. If your organization processes personal data, then ensuring compliance with national legislation and GDPR is vital, so you can extend your 27001 certification to include data privacy compliance through the implementation of ISO 27701. There's a top tip here. The Information Commissioner's Office really likes organizations that have implemented a security standard. 27701 doesn't have specific requirements for continuity, but it extends almost all of 27001 controls to include personal data. And then you've also got 27017, Information Security for Cloud Service Providers, also extends 27001 and has extra requirements for incident management. Why 14,001? Well, I mentioned earlier that the financial regulators expect organizations to consider their societal impact. Similarly, A responsible organisation should also consider the implications of their continuity plans on the environment. It has a section entitled Emergency Preparedness and Response, and again the requirements look very similar to other standards, as does 45,001 for occupational health and safety. And finally, 20,000 IT service management has a section on service continuity management. What is common throughout these standards is the risk assessment and the planning. They all require organisations to estimate what can go wrong, how it will hurt them, and then to plan for how long they can tolerate it, what they need to recover, what they need to do to recover, what they need to recover, and who do they need to tell. It's also worth pointing out that all of those standards direct you to consider your supply chain to varying degrees. Indeed, if I were to add 9001 quality management in the mix, then supplier dependency is called out. That begs the question about how do organisations seek assurance that their suppliers are operationally resilient. Of course, we'd recommend these management system standards because it's often very difficult to conduct supplier audits. And indeed, I am working on a webinar exactly about that, how to carry out supply chain assurance. So please keep an eye on the NQA website. But there'll be very few organisations that will implement all of these standards. But my point is that by implementing any one of them, those organisations are already thinking about resilience. And implementing 22301 in conjunction with any one of them places an organisation in a strong position to demonstrate resilience and their continued viability. So let's have a look at 22301. And I'm shamelessly reading from the standard itself because I can't think of another way of putting it better. It says the standard develops business continuity appropriate to the amount and type of impact that the organisation may or may not accept following a disruption. May or may not accept. I'll come back to this point later. And of course, it requires a business continuity management system, a BCMS, and that will provide a framework for understanding an organisation's business continuity needs, the processes and capabilities required for response structures in the event of an incident. And as you'd expect from a management system, there'll be monitoring, reviewing, and continual improvement. And again, as per ANNEX SL standards, it requires a business continuity policy, people who are competent, and a whole bunch of processes for policy, planning, implementation, and operation, performance assessment, and management review, and a set of mandatory documentation. So let's have a look at the benefits now. Leadership commitment to resilience. It demonstrates management commitment in an overall risk management with visible evidence to stakeholders. It encourages clear communications on what employees need to do to recover from an incident, and it supports cross-department and cross-organizational coordination. And for your reputation, it gives you an advantage over less resilient competitors, helping you maintain or even improve it through demonstrating a professional approach to managing disruption. And it sends a positive message to the media and stakeholders in crisis conditions. It helps you protect your organization and recover from a crisis. You learn things about your business, such as the most valuable and critical processes and their disruption. It will ensure a timely and ordered response to business disruptions to predefined levels necessary for contracts or agreements. And it increases the survivability of the organization, e.g., its operational resilience, and therefore the employees' jobs and, of course, their dependents. And it improves your financial credibility, such as when renewing your insurance policy, which could mean lower premiums. And the financial impact, when things go wrong, is already known and factored into your financial planning. And I'm told, although I've not been involved myself, that it provides evidence to support financial claims. Now, 22301, as I've mentioned, is an ANNEX SL standard. ANNEX SL is the standardized structure that many ISO management system standards are adopting. This means all ANNEX SL standards have very similar structures, as you can see there. You can download this comparison tool from the NQA website. You can see that each standard follows the clause structuring. So 4 is the context of the organization, 5 is leadership, 6 is planning, 7 is support, and so on. And then see the commonalities in the sub-clauses highlighted in the red boxes. There really is little difference between the standards apart from the context of the standard. That said, Clause 8, operations, is typically where the main differences lie across all the standards. 22.301 is highlighted in the blue box. So if clauses 4 to 7 and 9 to 12 in the standards are the heart of the management systems, clause 8 is where the actual business continuity work takes place. So hopefully now I've persuaded you that 22.301 could be a crucial component in your organization's operational resilience. Let's have a look at implementing it by going through the clause 8 sub-clauses. And again, I'll season this with some of my own experience, particularly when it comes to managing incidents. So first, plan, implement and control the processes needed to meet the requirements of the standard, and included within that, we mustn't forget outsourced processes and supply chain control. The standard requires criteria for operating these processes to ensure they're operating within a defined envelope, without which it's going to be difficult to measure their performance. And indeed, the standard states, keep documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned. The takeaway from this clause is that you must control your business continuity processes. It makes sense, and indeed it's obvious, but in the heat of the moment, when a disruption has got everyone in a flap, poorly defined processes or criteria can make things more difficult. Therefore, make sure all changes are controlled. And this is one of the areas where a management system framework can really help you control that. If you're not used to business continuity, then some of the terminology may appear daunting. But really, the business impact assessment can be boiled down to these 4 steps. The first is the most important, and is where you or whoever is doing this must know your organization. Identifying the key activities is the most important. It's harder for larger organizations, but it's the key to concentrating on what matters most. What are your key activities? These are often viewed in a process context, and to draw from ISO 9001 quality, you've inputs which are transformed to produce outputs. Identifying the key activities in one or more processes, and then listing them in priority order is your starting point. Looking at process dependencies may help you identify critical failures or choke points. And of course, you should have already defined your scope in clause 4, which will concentrate your focus. So if, say, you're a manufacturer, then your HR function is probably not in scope, so you wouldn't consider that as a key activity. And then you look at the impacts of disruptions to those activities, those key activities, over time. What are the kinds of events that could disrupt your operations? Fuel strikes, power failures, cyber attacks, key personnel sickness. They may well be unique to the organization, and some may well be generic. How long can you tolerate those disruptions before they become unacceptable? This is your maximum tolerable period of disruption. For example, if you have a critical machine failure that stops you manufacturing, how long before not getting the product out of the door you're going to start costing you? So then you define your recovery time objective. Note that this is not the time frame for restoring service, but really to what level and at what time. Do you really need to be back at 100%, or will 50% be initially sufficient? Would a lower level of recovery be quicker and buy you time? Then, what are all the activities and resources, both internally and externally, needed for the key activities? Knowing this helps you plan. The risk assessment is the next step, where you assess the likelihood of a disruption and the impact to produce a risk score. When you have a risk score, you can decide what your risk appetite is. What levels of risk will your organization tolerate? Now, assessing likelihood in a risk, given that risk is typically a product of likelihood and impact, but assessing likelihood can be difficult, especially things haven't gone wrong before. And we don't have the benefit of the Met Office's supercomputers to work out the future, but we can apply common sense. But please don't go for the middle ground. It might happen, it might not happen, because really that won't help. And if you want to know more about risk assessment and get some practice at it, NQA run a very good course on it. So when you know what your risks are, you start to design strategies and solutions to mitigate them. You have choices. Will you treat the risks with business continuity plans? Will you tolerate the risks, that is, do nothing? Or will you transfer the risks to your insurers? I'm assuming you're not going to terminate processes affected by the risks, but of course you could. The assumption here is that you're going to treat the risks with strategies and solutions. And I can't emphasize enough that you have business conversations with the bean counters and top management, but you talk to them in their language about what could go wrong: sales, reputation, recovery costs, share price impacts, etc., and the costs associated with whatever your business continuity solutions are. Some strategies are quite simple in principle, but more involved in practice. COVID caused a rush to home working, but not every organization had the remote access infrastructure to adequately support it. So the solutions should be carefully thought through and checked against the business impact analysis. And all the required resources need to be tactically factored into your strategies, and then you'll test them when you get to the exercise phase. Now, business continuity procedures. The challenge here is to have procedures that are specific. There's no place for ambiguity in a high-tempo, high-pressure situation, and yet they might need to be sufficiently general to cope with more than one circumstance. I mean, in simplest terms, one of the first procedures might be to call a specific person to invoke the plan. The important thing is that the procedures focus on the incident and that the appropriate people have defined roles and responsibilities. There's nothing worse than a bunch of top managers who all think individually they should be in charge. Believe me, I've been there and seen it, and it's not a pretty sight. Indeed, it's a mature organization that appoints an experienced but possibly junior person with the power to manage the disruption and then the recovery. So within that, structure is so important. Well-meaning vigilantes who stop hairs running, cause confusion and delay recovery, sometimes incurring additional cost. This means that people in scope of the certification must know who is responsible for responding to incidents. And that leads to communication. Possibly the most important factor in recovery is controlling the message. Comms should be managed by a single source which feeds internal and external comms. It should be in a timely manner, both up and down the management chain. Customers shouldn't have to learn that something has gone wrong from someone else's Twitter feed. Prevent rumors, shut down the grapevine, supply authorized comms only. Plans can be hard, especially if you've not written them before. But think them through step by step, using the strategies as the framework. And plans are like every good book, with a beginning, middle, and end. Sometimes you start at the ending and work backwards, but they should detail the recovery, the who, what, how, and by how much, and by when. Many organizations operate playbooks, which are available to appropriate personnel, most recently, of course, electronically, but sometimes in mini printed format, such as a flip book. And then don't forget the process for standing down the plans. What are the circumstances when people can be told to close the book, and who has the authority to make that call? I think exercising is the second most important after comms. Too many organizations leave their plans to gather dust. But it's only by exercising that you begin to understand the effectiveness and the efficiency of your plans. And it also helps people to remember that the plans exist in the first place and what they must do within the plans. There are different types of exercises, from desktop paper exercises to full-blown shutdown of your services. Your program of exercises should provide sufficient coverage of your disruption risks, and you should be satisfied that they're adequate. Choosing scenarios, though, can be difficult, particularly ensuring the full engagement of key stakeholders. A few years ago, I ran a day-long exercise for a CEO who insisted that all the directors were there in the boardroom for the exercise. But the exercise only really involved the IT services and customer services directors. The CTO, the CFO, and the marketing directors concluded that business continuity had nothing to do with them. So that was a failure of the exercise and of top management leadership. And then an often neglected part of exercising is the post-incident review and then implementing the findings. It is and it must be an iterative process. Unfortunately, 22301 ensures this happens. And then finally, in Clause 8, operations, we've got key evaluation of documentation and capabilities. And I have to say that this is an odd control that really doesn't have an equivalent in other related standards. And for me, it really is a repeat of the plan, do, check, act cycle, a bit like performance evaluation. But the standout thing for me is about evaluating suppliers and partners. How do you do that? If Microsoft, for example, is a supplier, you can't really go and audit them, although they provide a whole load of published information about their certifications and so forth. But depending on the size of your organization, you might not be in a position to audit them. But as you'd expect, an organization with ISO 22301, relevant to the services that you take from them, should give you a warm feeling. And similarly, if you're in somebody else's supply chain, having 22301 sets you in a great position. And on that note, I hope you found that interesting and useful, and it's time for questions. Let me just bring this up and see what we have. From Karen, sorry if I missed the start. Yes, you will be getting a copy of slides and recording. And then Mahali, is there any known statistics how often EU or US banks require a well-managed certified BCMS when issuing industry loans? That's a great question. I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that. I'm going to make a note of it though, because that's a great anecdote I'll include for future presentations, but thanks very much. I'll hang on to that. And indeed, keep an eye on my blogs on the NQA website, and that may well appear in there as well. Thank you, Rajalingam, much appreciated. Will NQA run a business continuity course in the future? Derek, yes, we are. And in fact, we do have one, but we're currently, a colleague of mine, Tony Bevan, is rewriting it as we speak. All of the NQA course dates are published on the NQA website. And I believe our Insight newsletter as well lists the training course event dates as well. So yes, and maybe, hopefully I'll be involved in delivering that. Okay, Derek, I look forward to seeing you then. Karim, you're most welcome. Okay. If there's no more questions, I'll close the webinar there. Everybody, thank you very much for your time. I hope you find it interesting. And yes, just to repeat, yes, you will be getting a copy of the slides and this recording. And as ever, there is plenty more information on the NQA website. Thank you. Goodbye.